Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University in the News. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Good, Jeff. Good to be back. We made it through the big New York storm where we got hit with 7 feet of snow, and it knocked us out for a good week from being able to do the podcast. So I'm really glad to be back on and to have no more snow here. It all melted.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. So we're doing another in the news episode, and we've got Jennifer here. So always great to have you on, Jennifer. What did you find for us today?
Well, thanks, guys. Today, our first article comes from California. In Oakland, California, the city council has passed a tenant protection ordinance that will punish landlords from harassing their existing tenants in an effort to get them to move out. Apparently, for Oakland in recent months, this has been a really big problem because I guess some of the greedy landlords have been really putting the pressure on and bullying tenants in an attempt to get them out so that they can rent to these newer tenants who are fleeing from higher rent cities like San Francisco, and they have deeper pockets and they're willing to pay more than what the current landlords are already charging. So apparently this was such a problem in Oakland that the city's rental adjustment program, they'd reported upwards of 200 phone calls a month for the last several months. So this new policy that was passed will mean that the bullying landlords will face these really steep fines if they step out of line. I just thought it was yet another example of a city that is having to enact these tougher penalties, even tougher than the state law, in order to better regulate these local issues. What do you guys think?
I find it really interesting that California is, a really hot place for news right now, and especially for landlords, and especially if you're in or around that San Francisco area. And obviously we're starting to see, the ring getting larger and larger of the areas that it's impacting. We saw everything kind of start out in San Francisco, and now it's starting to boil over and spill out. But man, it's crazy, all the activity that's happening there. Really. I mean, Jeff, do you hear it there being in California? Is it dominating the news there?
No, it really isn't. In fact, I had not heard about this particular article until Jennifer brought it to our attention. As far as San Francisco goes, there's no question there is a lot going on there in terms of all of these people that work for the high-tech firms coming in to live in San Francisco. And the high-tech companies are bringing buses in to take people to work, whether it's in San Francisco or down the peninsula in the Palo Alto, San Jose area. And so there certainly is a lot going on, and rents are going up like crazy in San Francisco, and it's getting harder and harder for people to find places to live. And certainly the lower income people are having a tougher and tougher time finding places to live in San Francisco. There are rent control laws in San Francisco where there aren't in many other parts of the Bay Area. And I don't know about Oakland, but obviously people are starting to go across the Bay and move into Oakland, it's going to be interesting to see how that changes the way Oakland is.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. They used a term in the article that you just don't hear very often. It's the genification, which is basically upper society moving in and pushing out lower income into an area, and that seems exactly what's happening here. I think that landlords are trying to take advantage of that prematurely. I don't know if that, like you said, how it's going to affect things in the long run, but clearly landlords are starting to get a sense that they can get a lot more for their units and are starting to jump the gun and get really greedy and thinking, well, if I can charge $1,000 more, immediately I need to get these people out.
Exactly.
that are not paying that. And I could see certainly from their perspective, but it's tough. I mean, it's that balance between, what is a good tenant really worth?
That's true. And, as far as the gentrification goes, that definitely has hit San Francisco. It's been a major topic of discussion for quite a while around here as a result of all of these people that are in the high-tech industry going into San Francisco. And that's part of what a lot of the people have complained about, that they're changing the fabric of the city because of the gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
And if we start to see that in Oakland, it's going to change Oakland significantly.
Right.
But I think the bottom line on this particular article is that the landlords are harassing the tenants to get them to leave. And it might be because they have rent control laws and they can't kick them out. That's a possibility. So if the tenant leaves, maybe they can raise the rent, whereas if they evict the tenant, they can't raise the rent. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the rent control there. But there's no reason for landlords to be bullying and harassing renters just because they want them out. If you've got a good tenant, you need to continue to treat them fairly.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. And then maybe, obviously at the lease renewal, that you could take, you could look at things in a different way at that point when you're deciding whether to renew the lease or to get another tenant. But I agree, and if they're doing it in these despicable ways, like they're purposely failing to do repairs or threatening tenants or threatening to take away amenities like parking spaces, things like that, it is bullying. I mean, you're doing these things purposely to try and get the tenant aggravated, to leave, and then obviously the immediate benefit is you get to turn a much higher price.
Exactly.
So, yeah, and I agree with Jennifer. I like seeing, during desperate times like this, I think there has to be some sort of an intervention from local, communities and municipalities to step in and say, hey, wait a second, something's not right here.
Right. It's on a different scale, and it's a slightly different thing. But we were talking before we started recording about where in New York, you guys have bans against people who, gas stations raising the cost. Or did we talk about that here on the? No,
it wasn't on the air. It was before.
Okay.
It was before we were recording.
Right.
But you're right. During a snowstorm, so everyone's immediate reaction is to get out and get gas, not only for snow blowers and things, but for your car. You don't know how many days you're going to be, not able to get around or have gas to be able to get out. And same thing with food. So, obviously supermarkets around here just literally clear out. It looks like some sort of post-apocalyptic event usually, when you're in the middle of the snowstorm. But yeah, the government will actually control, what people can charge for gas prices, because in the past they've hiked the gas up to $5-6 a gallon just to specifically gouge people, because they know that there's this huge demand all of a sudden, and they'll also limit how much gas you can get, because they don't want somebody going in there and taking more than their fair share and leaving everyone else sort of empty-handed. So, yeah, a good example of how government stepping in, and smaller government at the local level stepping in to help protect people. And obviously in that type of emergency situation, it's really necessary. And in these situations, I think it's the same. I mean, these lower income, they really don't have anybody to represent them on this. I think that eventually, long term, you're right, you may see that that turning of the tide. I think that Oakland may turn into a different area because of this.
Yes. And again, just to keep it clear, this is not some type of an anti-landlord law. This is a law that is protecting tenants from landlords who are bullying tenants.
Right.
And it's certainly not something that we support or feel is appropriate for landlords to do. And they're not using this. Well, they are to a certain extent using this to restrict these increases in rents. But if rents are going to go up, they should go up naturally and through good business, not through bullying and harassing tenants.
Yeah, I would say if you're a landlord in this area and you're sitting on you got the golden goose here. Potentially, you're in a great area where, long term, you can definitely really, really turn really good cash flow. Just be patient. Don't try and do anything underhanded or slimy. You don't want to be categorized in that slimy landlord group where you're doing things unethical to try and get somebody out so you can make a bit more money.
That's right. So Jennifer, let's move from California to Hawaii.
Yeah, that was an excellent segue, actually, about emergency situations. I found an article that comes from Hawaii. If you remember back in October, there was a volcano that was spewing lava that was moving quickly towards residential areas. At that time, the Hawaii Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs issued a warning and a reminder about the state's emergency proclamation procedures. And part of that includes a ban on terminating residential rentals. So, in other words, when a state enacts its emergency proclamation, the landlords cannot cancel the month-to-month rental agreements to get tenants out and rent to new tenants who may be displaced by this emergency. So
Mhm.
landlords in the lava, or just outside the lava zone, I guess, couldn't boot out month-to-month tenants in hopes of, same thing, charging maybe a higher rent, or taking advantage of some of these people who might be displaced.
Mhm.
So in Hawaii, landlords could not terminate any month-to-month rental agreements as long as that emergency was in effect. Once it was lifted, then things would go back to normal. I thought it was important to point out that the ban would not extend to leases that were fixed that would expire during that time. It would just be those month-to-month where they could just say, "Hey, get out. Here's your 30-day notice."
Mhm.
In Hawaii, in particular, landlords who violated that could face up to fines up to $10,000 per day.
Mm.
So I was really intrigued by this because I was wondering about other states, other different states and their emergency proclamations and how rentals would be affected.
Mhm.
And this wasn't really an area I was familiar with. So what do you guys know about this?
Uh, Again, if I can bring it back to my local state, New York, I know that recently we had not obviously not lava, but a situation with a flooding area that had just become so bad that they basically condemned a whole string of apartment complexes. And this was sort of in central New York, so not my immediate area, but we heard a lot about it in the news. And sort of a similar situation, there was some landlords in that immediate area that were really looking to capitalize on a disaster, a natural disaster, and saw it as a good opportunity to make some extra money, and so the state had to step in and say, no, you can't do this. Kind of the same premise. The landlords in that immediate area with available rentals were just gouging on the prices, trying to get the most possible, sort of that idea of supply and demand. But again, it crosses that line of being really an unethical thing to do if these people are dealing with a volcano. I mean, I, there has to be some sense of neighbor, I feel like, and there has to be some protection against these people, and protect the people that do have housing, and to know that they're going to be safe.
Yeah, I think one of the holes in this, Jennifer mentioned that if you have a lease that expires during the period of this ban, then you're not covered by this. So you could raise the rent at that point, and theoretically you could just kick out the existing tenants and bring one of these other tenants in
Mhm.
at a much higher rate. And I'm surprised that they didn't at least put in some type of rent control for those people. The problem is it would, if you sign a new 1-year lease, then those people are stuck in that 1-year lease for a whole year. So I can understand from a timing standpoint, maybe they could have made it a 6-month automatic extension or something. But I
Mhm.
agree, there's no reason for landlords to be gouging these tenants or taking advantage of this type of a situation where everybody in the community needs to be working together to try to make it through this difficult situation, because there are a lot of houses being lost. That's the bottom line.
Right.
Houses are being taken over by the lava, which means that those houses and those neighborhoods are no longer habitable. And so you have a lot of people who are looking for a place to stay, which means they'll pay a lot more. And so for landlords to just take advantage of that, it doesn't make sense. So I agree with this particular protection.
And again, just to kind of relate it to the most recent situation here with the big snowstorm, we saw this with landscaping and contractors and things like that in the area that were asked to help remove snow, because in the local communities, there's no shoveling this type of snow, the 7 feet of it. I mean, there's people that were literally dropping over dead. I think the death count was up to 14 or 15 from people shoveling, and just, you couldn't handle it. So these people, these landscapers are going out there with their bobcats or skid steers and helping to dig people out. And, I think one of the things that they don't always think about is some of these companies were really gouging people. I've heard of some of them charging $600 to dig the snow out, basically out of a regular sized driveway. And whether or not the people paid it or not, the word starts getting around, and then you start to hear about, in your local community, who's that guy or who that company is that was charging that. And I've got a handful of companies that I can rattle off the top of my head that I heard people talking about. So I think another long-term effect of this in a smaller community, you're also risking your name, your good name, and you don't want to be known as that terrible. Again, we're always talking about this, being known as that landlord or that terrible landlord. I think that being ethical and doing things the right way long term is going to serve you a lot better than trying to go for that quick money that you see available on the table because of a bad situation.
I agree.
So I think a lot of these landscaping companies that were gouging people on snow removal hurt themselves in the long run, because now that, that's certainly talked about, and people in communities and neighborhoods are talking about, oh, did you hear that so-and-so is charging $600? They'll never have business in that area again. So I think, for the landlords, a little different in Hawaii, but kind of the same premise. You don't want to, drag your own name through the mud either in situations like this and be known as that guy who tried taking advantage of everyone.
Yes, exactly. Well, great. I think we have come to the end of another episode of In the News. Jennifer, thank you very much for bringing these to us. Some more very interesting articles.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University. And remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.